Today's episode, what I really want to speak into is the idea of change. And I was just talking to people on Instagram before I started recording here. And I was saying that, life is constantly changing. Like, you as an individual are constantly changing. Your body is constantly changing. Your ideas are constantly changing. Your perceptions are constantly changing. If you're dating someone, they are constantly changing. If you're in a relationship, the relationship is constantly changing. And life itself is not a stagnant thing, right? Life itself is a constant evolution. Things are constantly evolving. New things are coming into being. Old things are being let go of. And I think life as a whole recognizes this, right? Like, life as a whole kind of recognizes this, but human consciousness, we might recognize it in a conceptual way, right? We might conceptually be able to look at it and say, like, okay, well, I can see that things are always changing, but in our subconscious and a lot of times in our bodies, we are in a relationship of resistance to that change. And I want to start today by really talking a little bit about the ego. And I think it's been a little while since I've really spoken in detail about the ego. Some of you have been with me for a while. You may have heard me speak about the ego, but I haven't really talked about it in detail in a while. And I want to speak about it today because the first thing I want to say is it's just so important that you're aware that you have an ego and that you are to some degree aware of what it is and how it operates. Now, you don't have to be a psychologist about it. You don't have to, you don't have to know every little intricacy of it, but just in general, to be aware that, like, you have an ego and to have an awareness of what the ego's agenda is and how it operates and why it operates that way. Because the way it really works, like when I talk about the ego, what I'm really talking about is we have a kind of an imposter in our minds. And most of us are being bombarded with thoughts constantly. Most of us are being bombarded with ideas and fears and opinions and perceptions and all this stuff. And it's just constantly being flooded into our minds. And most of us assume that all of our thoughts are our own, right? We assume that every thought that goes through our mind belongs to us. And I'm going to introduce an idea that might be surprising for a lot of you, is that most of the thoughts that go through your mind are actually not your thoughts. Now, I know that's even a weird idea, right? When I say that, you might be like, what the hell does that mean? Like, the thoughts that are going through my mind are not my thoughts? Well, I want you to think about it, okay? When we are very, very young, and there are different schools of thought around this, some people think that the ego is something that we are born with, that it existed before we were even born, and it's part of like what we bring in with us. Some people tend to say that it develops as a result of our human life, right? It's a part of growing up in this world. We develop an ego, and I don't really think it matters either way. Like, personally, I just tend to talk about it as though it's something we develop in this life. If we take it with us, if it's with us when we're born, then so be it. But I don't really think it matters one way or the other. I think what's important is to recognize that it's here now, right? And what's important is to recognize that it is a deeply ingrained aspect of ourselves. And when we talk about raising consciousness, or we talk about, I don't love this word, but enlightenment, or, like any version of raising consciousness or becoming more aware, what we're really talking about is undoing the ego. We're really talking about releasing the hold that the ego has on our mind so we can experience a greater perception of life. We can experience a greater perception of ourself. We can start to be informed by our authenticity rather than being informed by our fear. And when I'm talking about the ego, I'm basically talking about the part of you that holds all of your fear. And so when I said earlier, I said that, most of the thoughts that are going through your mind are not your thoughts. So what do I mean by that when I say that, right? Well, if we look at what the ego is, and the ego is something that from the time you were very, very little has responded to fear. And so maybe the first time you experienced fear was when you were being birthed, right? And I've often spoke about this, how we go from like this safe, warm, comfortable environment in our mother's womb where all our needs are met immediately, where we are held, where we are in perfect comfort, where we are provided for, where there is no concern, there is no doubt, there is no worry. And then all of a sudden something starts happening and the muscles are contracting and we're being forced, through this small hole that, like our head barely fits through. And it's like we're there's pressure and there's noise and our mother is screaming and like, all you've ever known up until that point in your life was being held in this warm and comfortable womb. And then all of a sudden you're being forced out and again, there's noise and it's cold and there's light and it's just like so much. It's a very jarring, it's a very shocking experience. So maybe your birth was the first time you experienced fear. And, who knows what it was like when you were growing up, but, some of you may have grown up in a very abusive household, in a very toxic environment. Some of you may have grown up with parents who were not abusive or overtly harmful, but maybe they were just kind of helpless. Maybe they just really didn't know how to take care of you. Right? And so because of that, you were often neglected or your needs weren't met and there are all different variations of this. Some of you might have grown up in a very loving home, but even if you grew up in a loving home, that doesn't mean that you never experienced fear, right? Like even the parents who loved us and did their best made a lot of mistakes. And I don't want to get too much into all of this, but what I want to get at here is that from basically the moment you were born and throughout your entire life, you've been experiencing fear. And there's a part of your mind that is very, very hypersensitive to fear. And that part of your mind is what I'll call the ego. And so what the ego has done throughout your entire life is it has had, like if you imagine, if you put on a pair of glasses that could only see the negative, that could only see what could go wrong, that could only see suspicion, and how are they going to hurt me? And am I going to be left alone? Am I going to be forgotten? Am I going to be cold? Am I going to be like, are my needs not going to be met? Am I going to be abandoned? Like, imagine putting on a pair of glasses that only can see those things in life. Well, that's basically what the ego is. The ego basically has no awareness of any aspect of life that is good, that is loving, that is safe, that is peaceful, that is kind, right? And it's not that the ego is against these things. It's just not wired to be present to them. The ego is wired to be present to the things that are scary, the things that can hurt you, the things that could cause you pain, the things that could wound you, right? And so what the ego does is from the moment you're born and throughout your childhood and then into adult life, the ego is constantly on guard for anything that is scary, dangerous, hurtful, and so on.